I had spent 6 solid months preparing for the single interview that was supposed to turn my entire life around, only to throw it all away because of a broken down car and a torrential downpour on a desolate stretch of highway outside the city. My name is Arthur Vance, and for nearly half a year, my existence had been defined by rejection emails, silent phone lines, and the quiet, heavy panic of watching my savings account dwindle down to double digits. When the logistics director position at Sterling Industrial Logistics finally opened up, I knew I was qualified, but I also knew that hundreds of other desperate applicants were gunning for the exact same desk. I had memorized their quarterly reports, analyzed their supply chain bottlenecks, and even drafted a 12-page proposal detailing how they could cut regional shipping delays by at least 15%. I pressed my only remaining clean suit the night before, arranged for a neighbor to watch my 7-year-old daughter Maya, and mapped out a route that gave me 45 minutes of buffer time. There was supposed to be no room for error, no excuses, and no unexpected detours. Yet, exactly 25 minutes before I was scheduled to pull into the Sterling parking garage, my headlights caught a hazard light blinking weakly through the gray sheets of rain. A sleek black sedan was pressed tight against the shoulder, and a woman in a soaked trench coat was crouched near the front tire, struggling with a stubborn lug nut while transport trucks roared past, sending cold waves of muddy water splashing over her. I checked the dashboard clock, did the frantic math in my head, and felt every muscle in my body lock up. Stopping meant risking the interview I had sacrificed 6 months to secure. Driving past meant leaving someone stranded in dangerous weather conditions that reminded me too vividly of the time my own car gave out with Maya in the back seat, and nobody slowed down to help. I pulled onto the shoulder before I even consciously decided to do it. The woman looked up as I stepped out into the downpour, her hair plastered to her face, and immediately waved her hand, telling me to get back in my car and go on my way, because she didn't want to ruin my morning. I ignored her, grabbed my trunk's tire iron, and knelt down in the freezing puddles. As I worked the rusted bolts loose, she watched me with sharp, assessing eyes, asking if I had somewhere important to be. I told her I had an appointment that had been months in the making, but that some things mattered more than punctuality. It took me 12 minutes to swap out the shredded tire for the spare, check the pressure, and pack the ruined rubber back into her trunk. She tried to hand me her business card, insisting she wanted to repay the favor properly, but I waved it off, told her she didn't owe me a thing, and hurried back to my vehicle. When I finally dialed the Sterling recruitment line to explain that I was running behind due to an emergency on the road, nobody picked up. I left a breathless voicemail, gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white, and hit the gas. I arrived at the Grand Glass and Steel headquarters 12 minutes late, my trousers damp at the cuffs, my hair a mess, and my heart hammering against my ribs. The receptionist looked up from her terminal with a sympathetic yet clinical expression, telling me that my interview window had officially closed. Before I could plead my case, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the lobby air like broken glass. Eleanor Vance, no relation, just a senior vice president with a reputation for absolute ruthlessness, was crossing the polished floor with her portfolio clamped tightly against her chest. She stopped a few feet away, glanced at her diamond wristwatch, and looked me up and down with open, undisguised contempt. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't care. She simply turned to her assistant and stated loudly enough for half the lobby to hear that a man who could not manage his own basic schedule had no business applying for a leadership role at Sterling Industrial. She flipped open my resume, paused coldly at the 4-month employment gap, and then dropped a casual, loaded question about whether I was still a single father trying to juggle domestic duties. I confirmed it, refusing to shrink under her gaze, and she offered a thin, mechanical smile that felt more like a threat than an acknowledgement. She declared the interview terminated before it even began, turning on her heel as if I were nothing more than a speck of dust on her polished loafers. I stood there in the echoing lobby, feeling the bitter sting of humiliation wash over me, believing the door had slammed shut for good. But just as I turned toward the exit, the heavy glass elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and the woman from the rainy roadside stepped out into the hall. She walked past the reception desk, her tailored charcoal blazer crisp against the stark corporate lighting, carrying an air of absolute quiet command that instantly pulled every eye in the room toward her. Eleanor Vance blinked, her professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second as she tried to readjust her footing, stammering something about how they hadn't anticipated the chief executive joining this preliminary screening. I stared at the woman sitting at the head of the long mahogany conference table, watching the water-stained threads of my cheap suit jacket, and realized, with a sickening jolt in my stomach, that the stranger whose tire I had changed in the freezing rain 20 minutes outside the city limits was none other than Clara Sterling, the chief executive officer of Sterling Industrial Logistics. She didn't smile at me, nor did she offer any immediate sign of special treatment, but her gaze was steady and piercing as she looked at Eleanor and remarked that they had already met out on the service road. The silence that descended upon the room felt suffocating, heavy with the sudden, sharp realization that the game had fundamentally changed. Eleanor tried to recover her composure, suggesting that perhaps our prior encounter explained my unacceptable tardiness. But Clara cut her off with an icy precision, reminding her that just moments ago she had insisted that reasons didn't matter when evaluating discipline. Clara pulled a sleek leather folio toward herself, opened it, and announced in a clear, measured voice that she knew nothing about how I performed under ordinary business conditions. But she knew precisely why I was late. She made it explicitly clear that she wanted the rest of the interview conducted strictly on its own merits, without bias working against me, and without sympathy tipping the scales in my favor. It was a fair boundary, one that kept my dignity intact and forced everyone in the room to look past the damp fabric of my clothes and the panic in my chest. Eleanor, sensing her control slipping away, leaned forward and steered the questioning toward a high-pressure case study involving one of our largest regional distribution centers, a facility bleeding thousands of dollars daily due to catastrophic shipping bottlenecks and furious clients threatening to break their contracts. The other finalist for the position, a slick, impeccably groomed candidate named Julian Thorne, whose family connections had paved his entire career path, had already proposed a multi-million-dollar software overhaul and a 6-month consulting timeline that sounded brilliant on paper, but would take half a year to deploy. When the folder of raw operational metrics was pushed across the table to me, I didn't see a complex software failure. I saw a classic human error in shift handoffs and outdated truck loading protocols. Within minutes, I broke down the exact time blocks where the log jams were happening, pointed out that the facility was overstaffed during slow morning windows and starved during evening rushes, and demonstrated how a simple 40-minute administrative delay in paperwork was choking the loading bays. Nolan Briggs, our chief financial officer, leaned forward with genuine intensity in his eyes, tracking every word as I sketched out a rough timeline on the back of a spare data sheet. Eleanor tried to interject, arguing that a high-level director shouldn't be bogged down in floor-level scheduling, but I answered calmly that a true leader must never be so far removed from the core operation that they fail to see where money is leaking in plain sight. Julian watched from across the table, his polished veneer suddenly looking brittle as Nolan began peppering me with aggressive, numbers-driven questions that I answered effortlessly from years of trench-level experience. When Clara asked what kind of capital investment my immediate fix would require, I looked her in the eye and told her it would cost practically $0 for the first 30 days. Just a redesign of shift handoffs and stricter adherence to existing departure windows. Eleanor's face hardened into a mask of pure resentment as she realized the narrative she had carefully constructed to eliminate me was unraveling piece by piece under the cold weight of actual operational logic. The tension in the boardroom was so thick you could have sliced it with a letter opener, and for a few seconds, nobody dared to make a sound. Clara leaned back in her leather chair, resting her hands lightly on the mahogany surface as she looked over at Nolan Briggs, asking him to pull up the supplementary data for the next phase of the restructuring project. Nolan quickly clicked through his laptop, projecting a fresh set of regional performance charts onto the wall screen, while I stood quietly by the edge of the table, waiting for the inevitable blowback from Eleanor. She was already whispering something urgent to Julian Thorne, her expression tightening into a hard, defensive mask as she realized her carefully laid plans to secure the directorship for her preferred candidate were crumbling in real time. Clara didn't give her the satisfaction of a prolonged debate. Instead, she turned her full attention back to me and asked how long I estimated it would take to roll out my scheduling adjustments across the remaining 5 regional hubs if the board authorized a full implementation. I didn't hesitate, because I had spent the last 3 nights staring at the industry reports Nolan had given me, mapping out the logistical bottlenecks in my head while sitting at my kitchen table after Maya had finally gone to sleep. I told her that with a dedicated team leader on the ground at each facility, we could stabilize the supply chains and eliminate at least 70% of the idle time waste within the first 45 days, without spending an extra dime on unproven software. Nolan nodded slowly, clearly crunching the numbers in his head and recognizing that my low-cost, high-efficiency approach was exactly what the struggling parent company needed right now to appease restless shareholders. Eleanor, however, refused to go down quietly, clearing her throat with theatrical annoyance and interjecting that we couldn't base multi-million-dollar operational decisions on the back of a napkin math of someone who didn't even possess an internal corporate badge yet. Clara looked straight at Eleanor, her voice dropping an octave into a tone of quiet authority that made the senior vice president shrink back against her chair. Clara reminded the room that the so-called polished strategies they had spent 6 weeks and tens of thousands of consulting dollars on had yielded nothing but missed deadlines and furious clients, whereas my impromptu analysis had correctly diagnosed the bleeding wound in under 10 minutes. The silence that followed was absolute, punctuated only by the low hum of the ceiling ventilation system, as the rest of the committee silently registered the undeniable truth of Clara's words. Realizing she was completely cornered, Eleanor gathered her portfolio, muttered something about needing to check on a separate department audit, and excused herself from the room with as much rigid dignity as she could possibly muster. Julian remained seated, looking entirely defeated, as he realized his golden boy status wasn't going to save him from being completely outclassed by someone who actually knew how a loading dock operated from the ground up. Clara formally announced that the board would move forward with a 30-day consulting contract for me, giving me full operational control over the primary distribution hub to prove my model under live fire. She instructed Nolan to draft the paperwork immediately and told me to report to the logistics floor at 7 o'clock sharp the following Monday morning. I thanked them both, keeping my composure steady on the outside, while a massive wave of relief washed over my chest, knowing that the grueling 4-month drought of rejections might finally be coming to an end. As I walked out of the corporate tower and back into the late afternoon sunlight, I pulled out my phone and dialed my neighbor to let her know I'd be picking Maya up a little early so we could celebrate with ice cream, feeling for the first time in months like the ground beneath my feet was finally solid again. The morning air outside the distribution hub was biting and sharp, carrying the heavy scent of diesel and wet asphalt as I pulled my battered sedan into the employee parking lot. It had been 2 weeks since Clara Sterling officially handed me the 30-day consulting contract, and every single second since then felt like walking a tightrope suspended over a roaring furnace. I stepped out of the car, zipped my jacket against the wind, and checked my watch. 6:45 a.m. 15 minutes ahead of schedule, exactly as I had promised myself the day I walked back into this sprawling industrial complex. The warehouse looked entirely different from the outside than it did from the paperwork upstairs. It was a sprawling labyrinth of steel racks, humming conveyor belts, and tired, cynical workers who had seen a dozen different managers come and go with empty promises and impossible quotas. When I walked through the main sliding bay doors, the noise hit me like a physical wall. Forklifts beeping in reverse, supervisors shouting over walkie-talkies, and drivers leaning against clipboards with expressions of deep exhaustion. I made my way directly to the primary staging floor, where the morning shift was supposed to be executing the new staggered handoff protocol I had designed during my initial trial. For the first 10 days, the floor supervisors had treated my directives with open hostility, whispering behind my back and dragging their feet on every minor adjustment, convinced that a temporary outsider was just another corporate stooge looking to justify his paycheck. But I didn't hold meetings to assert my dominance, and I didn't wave my contract around to demand respect. Instead, I grabbed a clipboard, strapped on a high-visibility vest, and spent 6 hours shoulder to shoulder with the loading crews, helping them untangle the physical bottlenecks in the paperwork chain. By the end of the second week, something subtle had shifted in the way the men and women on the floor looked at me when I walked past. They realized I wasn't just barking orders from an air-conditioned office upstairs. I actually knew why the pallet jacks kept jamming in aisle 4, and how a simple 20-minute delay in invoice processing could back up 20 outbound semi-trucks. Yet, even as the operational metrics began to climb steadily upward, with wait times dropping by nearly 40% and overtime expenses shrinking for the first time in 3 fiscal quarters, I knew the real battle wasn't being fought out here on the cold concrete floor. The real battle was still waiting for me on the executive mezzanine, where Eleanor Vance was quietly watching my every move, waiting for a single misstep to hand her the ammunition she needed to prove to the board that my appointment was a catastrophic mistake. The heavy metal doors of the loading dock echoed with the steady hum of forklifts and the sharp beep of reversing trucks as I stepped out into the crisp morning air, holding a fresh manifest in my hand. For the past 3 weeks, the new scheduling model had been running without a single major hitch, and the daily metrics posted on the office board spoke for themselves. Outbound delays were down by nearly 50%, overtime expenses had plummeted, and Redwood Freight Systems had quietly signaled that they were tearing up their cancellation notice. Yet, despite the undeniable numbers, the atmosphere on the executive mezzanine remained as cold and unwelcoming as ever. Eleanor Vance had spent the morning committee meeting trying to spin the facility's turnaround as a departmental initiative born from her own division's oversight, completely omitting my name from the progress report as if I were nothing more than a ghost in the system. I had sat quietly near the back of the conference room, refusing to engage in petty squabbles over credit, knowing full well that real results didn't need a loudspeaker to be heard. But Clara Sterling had seen right through the evasion. With a sharp, incisive question, she had forced Nolan Briggs to pull up the original metadata on his laptop screen, exposing my name clearly at the top of the proposal document for the entire executive committee to witness. The look on Eleanor's face when Clara invited me to the front of the room to present my own findings was a masterclass in suppressed panic. A fleeting second where she realized her 20-year empire of polished presentation and corporate maneuvering was finally colliding with an unmovable wall of cold, hard facts. I walked to the head of the table, looked every senior director in the eye, and systematically broke down how a simple shift in administrative handoffs had saved a multi-million-dollar asset from ruin. It wasn't about executive presence or smooth vocabulary. It was about understanding how the gears actually turned when nobody was watching. When the meeting adjourned, however, Eleanor pulled me aside near the private elevators, her voice dropping into a smooth, venomous whisper, designed to remind me that changing a tire or fixing a loading dock didn't automatically grant me membership into her exclusive club. She warned me that people on this floor spent decades building reputations that couldn't simply be overridden by a lucky break in the rain, making it crystal clear that her hostility wasn't going away just because the bottom line had improved. I told her calmly that I had never expected a free pass, turned around and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the polished hallway with her bitterness. I knew the war wasn't over, and that whatever came next would determine whether a company like Sterling Industrial could truly change its stripes or if it would simply snap back into its old, toxic habits. The heavy silence that followed the board meeting's abrupt conclusion lingered in the hallway long after the last director had filtered back toward the upper offices, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the climate control system and the faint scent of industrial coffee. Nolan had quietly slipped away to handle the preliminary paperwork for the 30-day trial, and Clara had retreated behind her frosted glass doors, leaving me to process the strange, surreal shift that had just taken place in a room where, less than an hour earlier, I had been treated like an invisible nuisance. I walked down the long carpeted corridor toward the elevators, my mind racing through the logistics of the upcoming rollout and the sheer mountain of work required to prove that my scheduling model could sustain its performance over a full month of live operation. As I pressed the button for the ground floor, a sharp voice echoed from behind me, halting my steps before the doors could slide open. It was Victoria, her pace measured and her expression tightly controlled, though the faint twitch at the corner of her mouth betrayed the immense strain of watching her polished narrative dissolve in front of the entire executive committee. She told me not to flatter myself, reminding me with a smooth, practiced venom that managing a single warehouse floor for a few weeks did not magically grant me the political capital required to survive at the executive level. I turned to face her, realizing with a sudden calm clarity that I no longer felt the burning need to defend myself or prove my worth to someone whose entire worldview rested on inherited status and closed-door favoritism. I simply looked her in the eye and told her that results had a way of speaking for themselves, and that no amount of corporate maneuvering could hide a broken system from someone willing to look at the numbers. She offered a cold, brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes, turned on her heel, and walked away without another word, leaving me to ride the elevator down to the lobby in absolute peace. When I finally reached my car, the evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the promise of an early autumn that felt entirely different from the heavy, suffocating weight of the previous months. I picked up Maya from her after-school program 20 minutes later, listening to her chatter excitedly about a playground game involving mutant squirrels and broken swings, and for the first time since the layoff notice arrived 6 months ago, I didn't feel the phantom hum of anxiety waiting for the other shoe to drop. Over the next 3 weeks, the distribution hub became my entire world, consuming my mornings, afternoons, and late nights as I worked side by side with the floor crews to iron out every minor friction point in the new handoff schedule. The metrics didn't just improve, They soared, with wait times dropping by nearly 60% and overtime costs shrinking so drastically that the finance department sent down an official memo of commendation. Redwood Freight Systems formally rescinded their cancellation threat, sending a glowing letter to the executive board praising the dramatic turnaround in reliability and turnaround speed. Yet, despite the undeniable success unfolding down on the floor, the political undercurrents on the executive mezzanine were reaching a boiling point as Nolan and the internal audit team began pulling together the pieces of the original hiring process. What started as a routine review of the departmental scorecards soon uncovered a deeply troubling pattern of manipulated metrics, unclosed conflicts of interest involving Julian Thorne's familial ties, and the systematic downgrading of qualified candidates based on personal circumstances that had no business being factored into a professional evaluation. The morning air outside the distribution hub was crisp and clear, carrying the steady, reassuring hum of transport trucks pulling away from the loading docks on schedule. It had been several weeks since the internal audit concluded its review, and Victoria Vance officially stepped down from her position, leaving behind an executive culture that was finally beginning to value operational substance over polished politics. My official transition into the permanent role of Director of Strategic Operations had been finalized not with a grand ceremony, but with a quiet, straightforward conversation in Clara's office, where we both acknowledged that the path here had been anything but ordinary. She made it explicitly clear that I was sitting behind that mahogany desk because of the metrics, the grueling hours, and the refusal to back down when the room tried to dismiss me, not because of a rainy morning on the service road. When she asked me before I signed the final contract what I would have done if my car hadn't broken down that day, I told her I likely would have arrived on time, though neither of us would have truly understood what kind of pressure the system was capable of withstanding. Weeks later, as I crossed the polished marble lobby on an ordinary morning, a young applicant rushed through the glass doors, flustered and breathless, trying to explain to a rigid front desk receptionist why his train had stalled. The receptionist began the familiar motion of turning him away, but I stepped in, asked if he had called ahead to notify recruitment, and when he nodded frantically, I simply told the desk to let him into the waiting room so his work could speak for itself. I didn't mention Clara, I didn't deliver a speech about second chances, and I didn't look back as I walked toward the elevators, knowing that the only way to truly change a culture where kindness gets buried under polished contempt is to simply refuse to pass that contempt down the line.